Okay, welcome everyone. I'm David Rammel, editor of Virtualization and Cloud Review, and I'm pleased to welcome you to our Identity and Access Management Virtual Summit, brought to you by Okta. Before we start today's event with 3 sessions, we do have some announcements. First, we want to let you know this event is being recorded and will be available for future viewing. You'll receive an email when the replay is available, generally within the next few days. Also, each of today's 3 sessions will be followed by a 5 to 10 minute Q&A. So please be sure to put your questions into the Q&A window of your console as they come up. During today's 3rd session, we will be giving away Apple AirPods Max headphones, but you must be present to win, so be sure to stay for the entire event. Finally, we do have resources from our sponsor Okta available on the console right now, so please download and check those out. It's because of Okta underwriting the summit that we can bring you this content. So we again thank them for sponsoring the summit and supporting the community, and ask you to check out those resources so we can bring you more events in the future. Now on to the first session of today's summit, Identity and Access Pain Point. Top issues from AD integration to SaaS control to compliance. This session features Nathan O'Brien, Microsoft MVP. From Portland, Oregon, Nathan is a Microsoft Certified Solutions Master, Messaging, and a 5-time former Microsoft MVP for Office servers and services. He specializes in Exchange, Office 365, Active Directory, Azure, and Teams. Nathan works as an independent consultant and actively contributes to the Exchange and Office 365 communities by writing articles for several tech websites and his own blog. Nathan, it's great to have you here. Please take it away.
Thank you very much, David, and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, friends and neighbors, children of all ages. Glad you can all join us here today. So today we're going to talk about Active Directory and Azure Active Directory, kind of identity and access management pain points. Got about, 40, 45 minutes of me saying fascinating and interesting things here. And then at the end, we will certainly open it up to any questions that you all may have. So if you do have any questions as I'm going through my presentation here, feel free to open up that Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Put your questions in there, and then Dave and I will try and go through as many of those as we can at the end of this. We are planning on wrapping this up about 5 minutes before the top of the hour, so we'll give you a quick little break there before we go on to the next session. All righty, let's get started then. So for most organizations, I do a lot of cloud migrations for organizations into Microsoft 365, Office 365, Azure, all that. Do a lot of those migrations, and I would say that Active Directory is still probably the heart of most organizations' identity solutions. Most organizations are keeping that on-premises Active Directory and syncing it up into the cloud for Azure Active Directory and then using all those other Microsoft Cloud services. So we're kind of going to talk about this morning my process as much as I can. What I go through with a customer when we're kind of planning that Active Directory integration into cloud services. We're going to start off focusing on AAD Connect a little bit. I'm not going to go into tons of detail on that, but that is kind of the primary tool that we will use to sync our on-premises Active Directory into Azure Active Directory. We're going to talk about how that tool can be really simple, kind of at the top level. And then as you progress into it, you can get into a lot of detail and maybe even get yourself into a bit of trouble with that tool. We're going to talk about, securing your authentication and authorization process in the Microsoft Cloud. So first thing I like to talk about with customers when we're planning a cloud migration is the on-premises Active Directory. I think it's very important to start off with a healthy on-premises Active Directory. So kind of the first question, is your on-premises Active Directory healthy? Do you have any problems with that on-premises Active Directory? If you do, I would highly recommend correcting those problems before you start your cloud migration. You want to make sure that everything is healthy, everything's working. everything's good in your on-premises Active Directory. I do have customers that I've spoken to that kind of want to get to the cloud as a solution for fixing potentially on-premises Active Directory issues that they may have, and I strongly recommend against that. Fix those issues on premises. Make sure your Active Directory is healthy before you start your cloud migration. Compliance is always a big concern now for many organizations, and compliance can be pretty difficult to manage. Obviously, there's a lot of information that goes into that, and it's really difficult. I think the most difficult thing about compliance, especially when customers ask me about this, is, what are the rules? How do I make everything compliant? Kind of the hard part about that is that compliance is really, kind of open-ended. There aren't set rules about, click this box, check that box there, make this setting or that setting. Really what it comes down to is you want to be able to verify, or you want to be able to justify all the choices and configurations that you've made if an auditor comes to you. I always use the analogy, compliance works a lot like your taxes do, which is to say that, if I were to put all my information for 2021 into a box, make 10 copies of it, send it off to the 10 best CPAs in the world, I'm probably going to get 10 different answers, as to what I owe on my taxes. Every one of those forms that comes back from a different CPA or whomever is going to look a little bit different. There's going to be a little bit different numbers in different spots. That's okay. What's important is that, if I get audited on my taxes, the auditor asks me, hey, why did you make this choice? Why was this number put in this box? You should have a good answer for that. Then you'll be okay. Kind of the same thing with compliance. You want to have good documentation and good justification for all the choices you make with your Active Directory and your identity solutions. So that's really the focus there. You want to make sure that your documentation is good. Make sure that everything's documented. Make sure that all the documentation is updated and it's reviewed and signed off by, a named management type person fairly recently. I always recommend at least 2 times a year. So your password policy or your data security policies, these things should be reviewed, updated, and signed off on by a named person, maybe your CIO, that sort of level, somebody who's a named person, not just the CIO, but you want it to be John Smith, CIO of your company. And you want that to happen fairly regularly, at least a couple times a year. Keep it simple. I always recommend, keep everything as simple as you can. Don't add extra bells and features and whistles because you think they're cool. Add them because you need them. Add them because, your users are using them. You have to be careful with turning on extra stuff that you don't need. Keep your group policy objects as minimal as you can. Extra accounts, everything. Keep everything as clean and simple as possible. That will save you a lot of headaches down the road. And then as you go to sync your Active Directory into Azure Active Directory in the Microsoft Cloud, there are supported scenarios where you can sync multiple on-premises forests into a single tenant, or a single on-premises forest into multiple tenants, or multiple forests into multiple tenants, kind of crossing over each other there. There's a lot of complexity you can get into that. Those are supported. They can work, but again, keep it as simple as you can to keep everything working. It'll make your life a lot easier. All right, as we move on to kind of actively syncing your on-premises Active Directory into Azure Active Directory, AAD Connect is the primary tool most organizations use for that. And AAD Connect can be a very simple, very wizard-driven tool at the top level. It's very easy, to just install AAD Connect, use the Express install, the Express configuration of that, click through a couple times, and have that set up. At a top level, that's very easy to do, and the the quick installation, the express installation of that will work well for most organizations. But I think it's really important for us to understand if you go off of that, customized that express install, there get to be a lot of options. It can be pretty confusing, and you need to really understand all those if you're going to go off that custom or that quick install. There are a lot of authentication options you can use with Office 365. I think that's really the first decision that an organization needs to make as you're setting up your AAD Connect and syncing it into Microsoft 365. What authentication method are my users going to use? I've listed a bunch of stuff there. Password hash sync is kind of the default. If you use the quick install option there on AAD Connect, it will use password hash sync. That is secure. I'm not going to go terribly into it. It is not password sync. It is password hash sync, so it's an encrypted version of your password that is synced up. You are not sending your passwords to Microsoft. I have a lot of customers that are concerned about that. You're sending a hash of your password to Microsoft. So it is pretty secure, and that is kind of the default that Microsoft assumes most organizations will be using, password hash sync. But there are a bunch of other authentication options too. Pass-through authentication, ADFS, rich client auth, cloud identity, modern authentication, and there are also third-party options from like our sponsor Okta today. My kind of feeling on those is what's important here is that you understand your authentication options, all of them, and then pick the authentication solution that best meets your organization's needs. Keeping everything as simple as you can. If password hash sync meets all your organization's needs, then certainly you should use that, and that's that's going to be Microsoft's default when they come up with new features and think about Office 365. They're kind of assuming you're using password hash sync. But if for some reason password hash sync doesn't meet your needs, then you need to understand and choose between all these other options, including third-party options. There are certainly instances, and I've worked with a bunch of clients who, have complicated authentication scenarios where some of the features of a third-party tool like Okta are what they need. And if that's the case, great, go for that. These third-party providers do come up with great additional features that Microsoft doesn't have and organizations may need. So those are always, if that's what you need, use those options. I like to make sure that customers keep everything as simple as they can, understanding that these are very complex systems, and the more complexity you add to that, you have to be able to maintain all that and keep everything working. Make sure you thoroughly understand these solutions. There are also some additional kind of sub-authentication features that can be very useful. Passwordless authentication, Windows Hello, FIDO, device authentication, certificate-based authentication. We'll talk a little bit about those as time allows going forward. But again, it's important to understand there's a whole bunch of different authentication options that can apply to Microsoft 365. And you need to really understand those if you're going off kind of that base password hash sync. After you decide how your users are going to authenticate into Microsoft 365, you do want to think about what to sync. There are filtering options available in AAD Connect or Microsoft Information Manager or even a third-party tool if that's where you're going. The most common filtering option would be OU filtering by OU. It's very easy to manage within AAD Connect. Just choose the OUs you want to sync or not sync. But then, I constantly have customers set that up, and then, why can't I get X, Y, or Z to show up in my global address list in Microsoft 365? It's often because it's filtered out. You didn't do that. It's not in an OU that's synced. There are other ways you can filter objects within your Active Directory as well. You can do attribute-based filtering, so you can specify a specific attribute, custom extension 10 or whatever, and then put, a value in that attribute so that objects are or are not synced. I strongly recommend people stay away from these more advanced filter options unless, again, there's a really important need for it. It's a good way to make this more complex than you have to if you go into that attribute filtering, or even the custom application-based filters. You can really cause yourself difficulties if you're mucking with those and don't fully understand them, what will or will not be synced in there. And of course, again, third-party apps, if the built-in Microsoft tools aren't meeting your needs, they don't have the features that your organization needs, there's usually a third-party tool that will have those features available, be able to ensure that you're getting the authentication scenario that your organization needs. All right, let's move on a little bit here. Next thing I like to talk about when I'm talking about setting up authentication with customers is multi-factor authentication. If you've heard other presentations that I've done here in this space, I almost always talk about multi-factor authentication because it's very important. Those top two lines up there on the screen, are still constantly surprise me. About 99+% of the compromised accounts that Microsoft finds in Azure Active Directory do not have multi-factor authentication turned on. If your account is, if you're worried about security at all, and you certainly should be if you have any data at all in the cloud, turning on multi-factor authentication is going to go a long ways to preventing any sort of breaches there. Absolutely important. Then that second line, about 10% of all the accounts in Azure Active Directory have ever had an MFA claim. So, Microsoft can look at this and can see that very small percentage of people are using MFA in any way. And I just find that completely unacceptable. Turn on multi-factor authentication and please use it whenever you can. That being said, I'm going to go on and talk a little bit more about not all multi-factor authentication is created equal. Obviously, there are different ways you can do multi-factor authentication. There are different, systems that you can use for this, and there are some that are better than others. While it's always good to have at least some multi-factor authentication turned on, things like phone calls and SMS text messages as that second factor, not terribly secure. That's fairly easy to hack. With SIM card spoofing or stealing your information on your phone, that sort of stuff. It's just not really very good. It's always recommended to use an authenticator app above any of those telephone-based multi-factor authentication choices. So using an actual authenticator app is great, or much better than using SMS or phone calls. And then another level beyond that, Microsoft has actually recently made great strides in improving the Microsoft Authenticator app. So you can use Google Authenticator to authenticate into your Office 365. LastPass has an authenticator. I'm sure there's a number of other companies that have different authenticator apps that you can use for this. Those work, they're great. But Microsoft has recently made some big improvements in the Microsoft Authenticator app that work well with Office 365, and I think I like to encourage organizations to kind of go in that direction. So I'm going to talk about a couple of those features that really do make the Microsoft Authenticator app much more secure and better. It has, admins can prevent accidental approvals in the Microsoft Authenticator app with number matching. So when you have that multi-factor authentication event logging into your computer, it will put up a number on your computer that you then need to type that number, usually a 2-digit number, into the Authenticator app on your phone. The importance of that is that anything that comes rote behavior for users, anything that users just automatically do without thinking about, can quickly turn into a big security vulnerability for your organization. So doesn't really do you any good to have multi-factor authentication turned on for your users' accounts if every time that little pop-up comes up on your phone that says, there's a sign-in event, do you authorize it? And users are just clicking yes on that without thinking if they're actually authenticating themselves. If that's somebody else trying to take over their account, then they're just letting somebody else in. So that number matching kind of forces users, to take the number from their computer, put it into the Authenticator app on their phone so that they know they're authenticating their own session in there and not a hacker's session in there. Also, we have GPS-based location or GPS location-based conditional access policies using the Microsoft Authenticator app. So you can, and I'll show you this in a little bit, you can put the information up on the screen of your Authenticator app where the sign-in event is happening. I'll show you a screenshot of that. It helps verify that it is you in your current position or your current GPS location authenticating in, and you're not getting an authentication event from Russia or China or something like that. And then finally, the last one we want to talk about is there's a little nudge campaign that you can turn on so that even if users do have multi-factor authentication set up and they are using something other than the Microsoft Authenticator app, you can put a little nudge up on the screen that tells the users, hey, good job using multi-factor authentication to log into Office 365, but we think the Microsoft Authenticator experience is going to be a little bit better. Please set that up. Let's go in and show those features here real quick. Number matching for Authenticator. If you go into, as you can see, this is my tenant, screenshot of it there. I go into security and authentication methods. There's a little configure button down there that allows you to configure these additional features to turn these features on for the Microsoft Authenticator app, users authenticating into your Microsoft 365 tenant. When you hit that configure button, this is the screen that comes up, and you can see you can require number matching and show additional context in notifications. So these are extra features that are turned on. These are how you turn on those features for your Microsoft Authenticator app using multi-factor authentication into Office 365. And then this, I put up an actual screenshot of my phone as I'm authenticating into Microsoft 365. So this is kind of that additional information beyond just somebody signing in, do you approve sort of thing. You can see at the top there, it's asking, are you trying to sign in? It says the tenant that you're trying to sign in and the account that you're trying to sign in with. It asks you to enter the number shown on the screen. So in your on-screen, in your authentication tab, again, it'd be probably a 2-digit number, 42 or 89 or whatever, that you would have to type into your phone to complete that authentication. It also shows you the app that you're authenticating into. In my case here, that was Remote PowerShell for Exchange Online. I was authenticating into. Works with all that. And then at the bottom, it shows you the location. I was trying to authenticate from Portland, Oregon, where I am. So I know that this is me authenticating into my Office 365, and I can click that to authorize this authentication into. Again, I think this is really important to kind of help users get away from that just automatically clicking accept when they get the pop-up on their phone. That can be a significant vulnerability there. All right. And this is a screenshot of the Use Microsoft Authenticator nudge. So here you can see somebody, Katie at Contoso.com, attempted to log in, and it says, yep, your multi-factor authentication, went through and worked, but hey, why don't we set up that Microsoft Authenticator app so we can take care of these so we can use these cool new features and be more secure. Great little tool there. Highly recommend that you consider implementing that in your Office 365 environment. All right, enough with the multi-factor authentication. I do see some questions coming in. Cool. We will address those at the end. And again, anybody, if you do have any questions, feel free to put them into the console, and we will address those at the end. Just looking through them real quickly here. Okay. So Azure AD Bad Password Protection. This is another great feature that's available in Azure Active Directory that allows us to help our users have better passwords in the cloud. Unfortunately, this sort of thing isn't directly available in on-premises Active Directory or as easily as available. It's not really a native feature of on-premises Active Directory that's easily configurable and usable by most organizations. But in Azure Active Directory, bad password protection is great. It's there, helps us out a lot. Prevents weak and insecure passwords. So there is, the list does automatically apply to all users when you set this up. There are actually 2 lists in there. Microsoft has a globally banned passwords list that is integrated in there. And it really covers, default and really common passwords, things like password or QWERTY, QWERTY, or 12345, whatever. So that's one list, and then you can specify another list of kind of organizational specific passwords. Many organizations, the company name, they'll use that for the password, or there's often common passwords that are used within an organization. So you can add those into this bad password protection list and then prevent users from using those passwords in Azure Active Directory. Those 2 lists are merged together to create the full list of passwords that can't be used by your users. And it also automatically bans variants of anything that's listed on that list. So you can see there if you put your company name in as a bad password, it will automatically identify when somebody replaces an A with an @ or an O with a 0, that sort of thing, to help protect that list and make sure that easy to guess variants of commonly used passwords aren't used. Azure AD Bad Password Protection is a great feature. Highly recommend looking into that. Help secure your Office 365, Microsoft 365 deployments there. Okay, once you get past the authentication part, there are also a bunch of good authentication practices and features available in Azure Active Directory that you can use. Some of these features kind of run over both. Some of them are more authorization, some are more authentication. The difference there is authentication is, you are the person that you say you are. I am Nathan at MCSM Lab, and I can connect in some way to my Office 365 tenant. Authorization goes more specifically into what I have the rights to access or to administer or to control or change whatever within that tenant. So authentication is just getting in. Authorization is what I'm authorized to do once I'm in. These are up here on the screen are some of the great features in Azure Active Directory that you can use to more tightly control that authorization part of it. Role-based access control. So there are, of course, we know built-in roles in the Office 365 portal there. You can make someone an Exchange administrator or SharePoint administrator, billing administrator. All those built-in roles for you within Office 365. And then each of the different sub-programs in Microsoft 365, so Exchange, SharePoint, Teams, you can also expand that role-based access control within each of those applications. So I'm mostly an Exchange guy. I know that Exchange, you can granularly control every bit of access to every PowerShell commandlet and even down to the sub-commands within that PowerShell command. So you can allow someone to run set mailbox, but not, set mailbox -type, I guess, so they can change it from a room to a user mailbox. That sort of control is absolutely available in there, and you can very tightly control what permission specific people have within your Office 365 tenant. Of course, the guidance here is always, that principle of least access. If somebody doesn't need access to do something, make sure they don't have it, keeps everything more secure. Conditional access kind of straddles the line. That's one of those features, kind of straddles between authentication and authorization. What conditional access is it's a great feature within Azure Active Directory that allows you to have different conditions for your authentication and authorization. So I have mine set up so that if I'm logging on to Microsoft 365 from the IP address that I use at home here, I have a different authentication flow. Don't need to go through as much to log in from my house. It sees that I'm logging in from that specific IP address, so the authentication flow is easier. But if I take my computer, out of the office here, go into Starbucks down the street, I may have to do additional steps to verify that it's me. So it allows you to use different conditions to control your authentication and authorization into Office 365. We'll show a little bit more about that coming up here. Continual access evaluation, brand new feature, just went generally available within Azure Active Directory. And we're going to talk about this in more detail in a slide coming up. But what it does is it continually evaluates your session so that if conditions change, or if some specific conditions change after you're already logged in, your access, either authentication to the whole tenant or authorization to a specific part of the tenant to a specific right, can be removed immediately. We've all seen that. Log into a domain controller, you need to do a schema update, but you're not a member of schema admin, so you go in, add yourself to schema admins, and you have to log out and log back in so your tokens are rebuilt on that authentication event so that you have the proper permission. Continual access evaluation allows changes to your account to take effect, allows your access, your rights that you have within that session to take effect immediately without you having to log on and log off and log back on. Another slide on that coming up. And then privileged identity management. Another great feature that highly recommend administrators, for administrators specifically. So kind of the long-standing guidance for administrators has been that you should have one account to do your work. You have your email attached to that account. You have generally a basic user account that doesn't have admin permissions. And then you should have another account to do the admin work, so that you have to log in with that second account. That second account isn't always logged on. You're not going to be walking away from your desk with the admin account logged on. What privileged identity management does is it allows you to keep just one account that doesn't have administrative rights standing all the time. Then you can go to the Azure Active Directory portal or use a PowerShell script to either elevate your rights yourself or to request that your rights be elevated. Gives us as administrators the ability to go through our daily work process with just a regular user account and then elevate those rights to administrators as we need them. For my own account in my Office 365 tenant, I keep view-only admin rights always assigned to my account so that if I need to, I can go into any of the Office 365 tools, Azure Active Directory, Exchange, SharePoint, whatever. I have view-only rights to everything, but before I can make a change, I have to go back and elevate my account, give it the administrative rights I need, so that if somebody else does get into my account, they won't have standing admin rights to make changes to everything. And then kind of the last thing under authorization I wanted to bring up here is that zero trust architecture idea. Kind of that idea of assuming that any user and any computer on your network could be breached at any time. So how do we limit the damage that can happen from a user that their account has been stolen, or a computer that's infected with a virus, something like that. We really, it's important to kind of assume that any user or any account could be breached anytime, and we understand how we can mitigate those potential damages and prevent, a hacker getting in and doing terrible things within our tenants. Let's see, I do have a bunch more slides here, and I'm running a little short on time, so I'm going to go a little bit. I'm going to try and speed up a little bit here. Conditional access, kind of talked about this already a little bit, but it allows for improved authentication flows for more specific security situations. Again, if you have maybe more sensitive information in a specific SharePoint library or in SharePoint, you can require that users use multi-factor authentication to access that, or maybe use a more secure form of multi-factor authentication to access that. Or maybe you have, a specific dedicated computer that users from the factory floor can log on and see their email, but they can't access anything else from that computer. Conditional access allows a lot of those scenarios to take place. Kind of early on in the Office 365 life cycle, I would have to deploy ADFS a lot for organizations that wanted to make sure that users could only log into their email from work. Was an issue that, hey, we have a bunch of users that get paid hourly. We need to make sure that they're not logging on from home, and then, saying they need to be paid for that time. So ADFS was the only solution early in Office 365 to control that. But now with conditional access, we can say users can only log on from specific IP addresses or specific locations that are set up within conditional access. It gives us more strength and an ability to control those authentication flows and improve that security. Recently added to conditional access, there's about 14 different default templates in there for you to use. So if you're new to conditional access, it's a bunch of new templates that have been set up in there for you to use. Makes the process of figuring out how to use conditional access and what you can do with it a lot easier. Go ahead and check out those templates when you get a chance. I think that'll make the deployment process a lot easier. Let's see, then there is this conditional access overview dashboard. Allows you to kind of see where the policies are going, who's being applied to those policies, how those policies are working in real time or in close to real time in your environment. And kind of another new feature here for conditional access, device filters. Again, this is for requiring specific devices to be used to access specific data. So maybe you have, again, a secure email account or a secure SharePoint site or something that has more sensitive information that you need to control. You can say users can only access this information from a specific machine. Allows us to get more control and better filter over those conditional access policies. Continual access elevation, next one on that list there. There's really two different areas that continual access evaluation focuses on. First is critical event evaluation. Things like the user account is deleted or disabled, password for a user is changed or reset, multi-factor authentication is enabled for a user. So if you enable multi-factor authentication for a user while that user is already logged in with a single authentication, continual access evaluation can interrupt that user session and require them to do multi-factor authentication at that point. Administrator revokes all tokens or high-risk users detected with Azure AD Identity Protection. So there are Azure AD Identity Protection is one of the higher-end features available with that Microsoft 365 E5 license and some of those higher EMS licenses. And users can be blocked out of their session if like a leaked password is detected. So if Microsoft detects that this user account and this password is posted up on the dark web somewhere, you can end that user session immediately, force them to call the help desk and kind of go through troubleshooting that and ensure that their account is secure before they're allowed to continue with their session. And then the other kind of situation that continual access evaluation does work for is conditional access location changes. So again, I said earlier that the conditional access for me, my authentication flow is different if I log in from home than it would be if I log in from the Starbucks down the street. Now with continual access evaluation, if I can log in at home and then unplug my laptop from my home Wi-Fi and walk up to connect to Starbucks. Before that wouldn't force me to re-authenticate to use that more stringent authentication flow. But now with continual access evaluation, it does, or it can force me to go through that when things change in my session. Great feature. Highly recommend checking that out. Privileged identity management. Kind of talked about this briefly a little bit ago, but it allows for, again, instead of having that separate administrator account, you can use PIM to either grant yourself elevated rights or to ask approval for elevated rights, so that your account doesn't have those standing admin rights. You can activate those admin rights as needed. They do expire after a specific amount of time. Set up the default time in there when you're creating these roles and allowing people to elevate for those roles or ask for approval. But the time can also be changed. So, if you set the default time for 8 hours and then somebody only needs it for an hour, they can put it into that authentication flow and then have those rights expire after an hour. That sort of thing. And again, it can be set up so that it needs approval, so that, if you have a junior admin who maybe comes in on the weekends and needs to do something, they can ask for those rights so that someone else has to approve those rights before they have them. Privileged identity management, great feature. Highly recommend using that to help secure your administrative accounts. And then going to leave about 10 minutes here for questions at the end. I do see we have some questions coming in, so go ahead. If you have any more questions, feel free to put them in there. We're going to get to them in just a couple of minutes after I talk about monitoring. Monitoring your Office 365 authentication and kind of features, functionality, make sure that everything working is, of course, terribly important. Put just a little bit in here at the end about that. There are a couple of ways you can monitor Microsoft 365. Of course, the M365 Service Help page tells you about all the services, incidents, advisory, history of those, and any reported issues, so you'll know if there is a service-wide outage that is preventing your users from getting into Office 365. You can see that on that Service Help page. I also do recommend administrators use the mobile app, the admin app, Microsoft 365 admin app. I have that installed on my phone. And I have it set up to give me push notifications. So when something goes wrong with Microsoft 365, when there's a service outage, when Microsoft is aware of a problem, I get the little push to my phone, pops up on my phone, tells me, hey, this feature in email isn't working, or there's something we're aware of with SharePoint that isn't working. Gives me the opportunity to kind of be ahead of those outages, understand, what's going on. And I find that if your users are told ahead of time about outages, about problems that they may have, they're way less grumpy about it. Whereas if they're calling the help desk and reporting these problems to you, not always the greatest. So, everything you can do to kind of keep ahead of those outages, make sure that you understand how your user's experience is going to be going for that day. Great idea. You can, of course, get email notifications from the Service Help page as well, if you'd like that. And then, the last thing that I wanted to touch on real quick before we get into questions, Azure AD authentication monitoring. So You see here up on the screen, this is kind of a quick screenshot I did of the authentications into my Azure AD. You can go in, you can see who's authenticating, how they're authenticating. You get lots of details about that. So if you do end up in a situation where you've turned on any of these snazzy new features that potentially, make it more difficult but more secure for your users to authenticate into Microsoft 365, you can go here, you can monitor those authentications, you can see why the user's not getting in, what's going on with that authentication, and understand what really the issue is so you can get all that corrected, have everybody get the access that they need into all the systems that they need. All right, so that pretty much wraps up what I had to go through here today. So I will bring David back in. I see we do have a bunch of questions in here, and we will go through as many questions as we can in the next 10 minutes or so.
All right, great job. Let's get right to those questions. We have a bunch of them. So let's just go in the order that they were received. First come, first served. So Nathan, if you want to follow around and read the questions while I'm asking them, we'll start out with Sandra. Sandra says, do you have any recommendations for ways to check the health of our on-prem AD?
Whew, boy, that is a big question, going to be difficult to completely answer here, in the limited time that we have. Obviously, an on-premises Active Directory can be kind of a big and complicated, even for small and mid-sized companies. You're going to have multiple domain controllers and a lot of information in there. There is a script that I like to use that I don't remember straight offhand who wrote it or where I can get it. I'll put it on my Twitter there, maybe in a little bit. Or, of course, you can reach me, Twitter @MCSMLab. Probably could figure out my email address if you looked a little bit throughout this presentation. Not that hard to get a hold of me. But there is a Active Directory kind of health checker script that somebody wrote that I like to use as kind of my starting point for evaluating Active Directories. But it's really a pretty difficult question to give a good answer to in just a couple minutes here. Active Directory is big, and there's a lot to it. I will share that script if you get a hold of me after the session.
Okay, great. So look on his Twitter account for that script. Very useful tool, it sounds like. Okay, the next question comes from Emily. She asked, how to address international users not wanting to download an authenticator app due to country laws?
Right. So it's again kind of a difficult problem to solve. So of course there are different rules in different countries, and in some countries, specifically stuff like France, for instance, there may be limitations on what you can ask users to do with their own equipment. Of course, I'm not an international attorney. I don't know all the differences in laws in different countries. But in general, this comes up for just in the U.S. too. My user base, I can't require that my users have their own phone at work with them for multi-factor authentication. Or, I can't, make my users use their own phone for this. My company doesn't provide phones to them. And that can be difficult. Basically, what I'd recommend is have a conversation with your management, explore what sort of other multi-factor authentication options you can use. Of course, you can use, telephone, landline, or SMS. There are other multi-factor authentication items you can use for that. Besides, everybody having to have their own personal phone with an authenticator app installed on it. But that's more of a political question. So, you really have to work with your management in your organization to figure out what sort of multi-factor authentication options that you're allowed to require, and then set that up as best you can.
Okay, next question is rather involved. If you want to follow along in the Q&A box, Nathan, it comes from Sean. Sean says, when deploying MFA, how do organizations enable third-party vendor login parentheses, managed customer support or managed network management, or consultant or contractor access, like for 1 week to 5 months, especially rotating foreign workers, such as from India, Eastern European workers, South America, etc.
Yeah, we are really coming with the difficult questions here today. Boy, again, this is like the first two questions. This is something that is going to be specific to each organization, and probably the best advice I can give you is work with your management to figure out what you can require and what you can't, and then make your Office 365, Azure Active Directory, on-premises Active Directory as secure as you can within the limitations that you're given by your management. I know it's not exactly an easy answer. It's not necessarily the answer you're looking for, I understand, but there is no easy, simple answer here. I understand, consultant or contractor access. It's hard to require. You can't send an RSA token to everybody to use. Authenticator apps are nice. Most people have a phone you can use an authenticator app with, but I can understand where, that if you're using somebody in India or something, maybe they don't have a phone, or, even within the U.S., it's difficult to 100% require that if somebody's going to come in and work on your network, that they have their own phone, that they can provide their own phone and install an authenticator app on that. So there's really no easy answer here. I would say just work with your management, make sure that the organization management all the way up the chain understands the difficulty, the security risk to not using multi-factor authentication, and then work with them to implement the best solution that your organization can support.
Okay, great. Let's move along to a more simple question. So another question from Sandra. It says, using critical event evaluation, can we find out who deleted or disabled accounts or changed passwords, etc.?
So that's not exactly a feature of CAE, but that is within either on-premises Active Directory or Azure Active Directory. That's a function of the normal logging. On-premises Active Directory, you have to make sure that you have changed password, who changed the password, who enabled or disabled the account. You have to make sure that is logged in your on-premises Active Directory, and you have to make sure that your servers have enough space to retain the logs for the amount of time you need. That can be a lot more cumbersome on-premises, ensuring the proper logging of these Active Directory events, whereas in Azure Active Directory, all that's logged for you pretty much by default, pretty much from jump. Those account changes, password changes, that information is logged in Azure Active Directory for you by default. On-premises Active Directory, you need to go through and ensure that that is being logged on all your domain controllers, know where those events are stored, make sure that your domain controllers have enough space on them to store those events for whatever time you need those events retained for.
Okay, looks like we have time.
All right, David, I think we probably have time for like one more here before we give them a break before the next session.
Yes, and it comes from Topher. He says, in the PIM, is there monitoring of the activities, PS logs, that can demonstrate intent or behavior? Well,
obviously, it gets tricky when we talk about demonstrating intent. I assume that this question is kind of, formed around more of an investigation kind of situation where, you have a potential breach or a potential, somebody within your organization or maybe somebody outside your organization is accessing something that they shouldn't be. You're going through a security investigation, trying to figure out what's happening, and you're looking for more context on specifically, what's going on and why it's going on. I would say that within privileged identity management, no, that's not really a feature. but there are some of the more advanced features in that EMS license, things like Cloud App Security, or it's not called that anymore, it's Defender for Cloud Apps. Really the Microsoft Defender for whatever. There's probably about 4 or 5 of those different features currently in the EMS stack that all start with the Microsoft Defender family. Cloud App Security, I know, is one they just changed recently the name of to be Microsoft Defender for Cloud Apps or whatever. But that stack of features, those EMS stack of features, does include some investigation tools, some tools to help you go through in the case of a breach and figure out what happened, who accessed what, from where, how they accessed it. Of course, the why is not really technically determinable, but you can get good information from those EMS features, Microsoft Defender stack.
Okay, great. Well, it looks like that's all the questions we have time for. So thanks again, Nathan, for a great presentation and answering those questions.
Thank you very much. Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Okay, everyone else, stay tuned. We're going to take a short break and be back at the top of the hour for our second session of the day, Identity and Access Management Best Practices, what IT pros need to know now. Also a good time to check out those resources on your console provided by Okta. So do that, and we'll take a break and be right back. Okay, welcome back, everyone. Thank you for being here. And thanks to our speakers and, of course, our sponsor, Okta, for underwriting this summit and allowing us to bring you this great content. I'm David Rammel, here to moderate the second session of our summit called Identity and Access Management Best Practices, what IT pros need to know now. Our speaker for this session is Brian Posey, freelance technology author and 19-time Microsoft MVP. Throughout his career, Brian has written or contributed to dozens of IT books and created numerous full-length video training courses and published thousands of blog posts on a huge variety of IT and space-related topics. Many of those blog posts can be found in his Posey's Tips and Tricks column or in his new Posey's Moonshot column, where he details his adventures in astronaut training. It's great to have you here, Brian. Please take it away.
Hey, thank you so much, David. So, yeah, as David mentioned, I'm Brian Posey, a 20-time Microsoft MVP and commercial astronaut candidate. And on the screen you can see from a couple months ago, I did my first underwater spacewalk. That's a mock-up of the Quest airlock on the International Space Station that I'm on the outside of. At any rate, let's go ahead and get started. Now, I got to admit, when I was approached about doing a presentation on IAM best practices, it was a little bit daunting because it would be fairly easy to write an entire book, a good-sized book at that, on IAM best practices. It's a huge subject. So I'm going to be really hard-pressed to cover everything in the presentation in the amount of time that I've got. And there's probably going to be quite a bit of topics that I won't be able to address. So having said that, let's go ahead and jump in. And I want to begin by just talking about what IAM is. Now, that probably seems like kind of a silly question, especially being that I'm the second presenter of the day, and everybody on the call presumably knows what IAM is. But there's a method to the madness. One of the reasons why I wanted to start by asking such a simple question of what IAM is just because what I've found is it varies from one provider to another. Everybody seems to have their own idea of what IAM is. Yes, it's identity and access management. That's a given. But if you go from one vendor to another, you'll find that their IAM solutions all entail different components. So typically what you'll find with IAM is that it's a combination of directory services, application and data management, and identity protection. Now, there might be some variances on that, but those are kind of the basic building blocks of IAM. And I agree with that 100%. But having said that, I also view that definition as being completely inadequate because there's a missing piece to the puzzle. Now, I'm not going to say just yet what that missing piece is. It's something I'm going to get into a little bit later on. But that's something to kind of put in the back of your mind. So one of the first questions that I wanted to talk about is, how does IAM differ from Active Directory? Well, in some ways, Active Directory could be thought of as a form of IAM, but really, directory services are one piece of the IAM puzzle. So certainly directory services and Active Directory fall into the scope of IAM, but IAM can include a lot more than just Active Directory. And remember what I said a moment ago, every provider handles IAM a little bit differently. So the Microsoft solution is based on Azure AD and on-premises Active Directory services, but if you get into something like Amazon Web Services, they handle it completely differently. So why am I telling you all of this? Well, as I said a moment ago, there is a method to the madness. And the point that I wanted to make is that this presentation is all about IAM best practices. The actual mechanisms for implementing those best practices are kind of secondary concern because the mechanisms are going to differ depending on which platform you're on, whether it be an on-premises system or one of the big hyperscaler clouds. So the way that you would go about implementing these best practices really varies from one platform to another. So it's the best practices that are really important. And as you develop the best practices strategy that's going to work for your environment, you have to consider how those best practices are going to be able to be implemented across the various platforms that you're using. Because let's face it, most of us aren't just using one platform. A lot of us have an on-premises footprint, but we may be using multiple cloud providers. And what I found is each one of those providers has their own best practices. And sometimes those best practices align with one another, but sometimes they're completely contradictory. So you have to really stop and think about what makes sense for your own organization and how you can implement that best practice across all of the various platforms that you use. Because if you really stop and think about it, technology is anything but static. Technology changes over time. So the clouds that you're using today might not necessarily be the clouds that you're using 10 years from now. New providers come along, old providers might go away, technology changes drastically. So as you're thinking about IAM best practices, think less about the implementation method as much and more about what those best practices really should be, how they make sense for your company, and which of those best practices are going to be scalable in that they can be positioned on multiple cloud platforms. So the goal is consistency. Look at the big picture. So with that said, I wanted to just kind of take a second and show you what IAM looks like on some of the cloud platforms. Now, there's going to be a little bit of hands-on stuff in this presentation, but not a whole lot. More than anything, I kind of wanted to just give you a preview of the idea that different platforms have different ways of doing things. So what you see on the screen right now is Amazon Web Services. And Amazon Web Services, for anybody who's not familiar with it, is the Amazon cloud, and they've got this huge list of services that you can implement through the cloud. So this is the services menu, and if you look at the lower left portion of the screen, you can see security, identity, and compliance. And if you click on that, you're presented with all of the different options that you see on the right. And the second option from the bottom is IAM. And if you click on IAM, you're taken to this screen right here. And there's a few different things that I wanted to point out on the screen. First is on the left of the screen, we have a series of tabs. And these tabs are useful in that they kind of give you a sense of what Amazon considers IAM to be. We can see tabs for things like users, user groups, roles, policies, identity providers, and account settings. So certainly I would agree that every bit of that falls into the scope of IAM. Another thing that you'll see is a big dashboard display right in the middle of the screen that says IAM resources. And you see things like user groups, users, roles, policies, and identity providers. And I just wanted to point that section out, not because it's so much useful for anything I'm going to be covering in this presentation, as much as I want to show you how this matches up with what Microsoft has in Azure. The more important thing that I wanted to show you on the screen is the security recommendations section right up the top of the dashboard. And there are two recommendations that are being made right off of the bat. The first one is add MFA for root user. So MFA being multi-factor authentication. And the root user, if anybody's not familiar with it, it's the user account that was used to set up your Amazon Web Services or AWS account. So this is an administrative user account that has access to absolutely everything within the account. So that best practice is to add multi-factor authentication for that root user, and that's something that I would absolutely agree with. And that's also something that you'll find as being a consistent best practice from one platform to another to another. Microsoft makes a very similar recommendation, which you'll see in a little while. The second recommendation is deactivate or delete access keys for root users. So on one hand, Amazon's telling you to enable multi-factor authentication for your root user. On the other hand, they're telling you to delete or to disable your root user account. So you have to really stop and think about what's going to be best for your organization. And this is also one of those examples where a recommendation that's made here is often contradictory with recommendations that are given by other providers, because certainly there can be consequences to deleting or disabling your root user account. And that's something I'll get into a little bit more as we go along. So what about Azure? Well, this is Azure Active Directory for anybody who might not have seen it. And I've clicked on Azure Active Directory. I'm in the Azure Active Directory Admin Center and clicked on Overview. And the main thing that I wanted to point out on the screen is if you look on the far right side, about halfway down the screen, you can see a dashboard display for users, groups, applications, and devices. It's very, very similar to that dashboard display that you saw in AWS. So the main thing I wanted to point out is that there is a bit of consistency between the two environments, even though they look completely different. Also, the menu options are fairly similar. We have users, groups, external identities, roles and administrators, and so on and so forth. So switching from one cloud platform to another isn't a completely foreign experience. That's why it's possible to formulate best practices that will work in multiple cloud environments. Now, another big component to Azure Active Directory with regard to identity management is something called Secure Score for Identity, and you can see it on the slide right now. Now, admittedly, I did a cut and paste to put this here. In real life, it's a little bit further down on the screen. I had to crop the screenshot to be able to fit it in. So if you go out to the Azure Active Directory Admin Center and you can't find the Secure Score for Identity, just scroll down a little bit. It's toward the bottom of the page. So this is what the Secure Score for Identity looks like. And there are a number of elements that are going on here, but let's stop and take a look at these for a moment. In the upper left corner, we have the actual Secure Score for Identity, and you can see when that was last updated. And that Secure Score is expressed as a percentage. So 100% is a perfect score, and then anything lower than that shows that there may be room to improve your identity management in the Azure AD platform. So the next thing that we have off to the right is a comparison. So what you see is your own organization score, and incidentally, this is for a lab environment. That's why the score is so low. But just beneath that, you see the average score for a comparably sized company. So the score that you're seeing is for a small business, which Microsoft defines as 1 to 1,000 persons. And you can see right here that the typical score is about 57% compared to my 17.86%. So the important takeaway here is that at least in smaller organizations, achieving a 100% score isn't necessarily realistic. Certainly not everybody out there is having a 100% identity secure score. And the reason for that is that as you enable the various mechanisms that will allow you to achieve a higher score, there are sometimes consequences to doing so. So you have to balance security with practicality. On one hand, it's extremely important to keep your organization secure. That's a given. Everybody knows that. On the other hand, it's also important to make sure that you implement security in a way that's not going to make your users miserable and not get in the way of users being able to do their jobs. So then, in the upper right portion of the screen, we see the score history. As you change settings within Azure AD, it can alter your score. And so that chart that you see shows how your score has changed based on any changes that you've made in the Azure AD environment over the last 7 days. But there are also options that you can click on to look at the last 30 days, the last 60 days, and the last 90 days. So then, if you look at the lower portion of the screen, you can see improvement actions. And I've got two listed here. Again, I had to crop the screen to get everything to fit, so there are actually a lot more, and I'll get into some of those later on. But you have several different columns of information here. You have the improvement action, which is something that you can do, something Microsoft recommends to improve your identity score. And a lot of these improvement actions can be regarded as best practices. Maybe not all of them, but a lot of them. The next column is the score impact. So in other words, if you perform this particular action, how much of an improvement is that going to make in your score? So the first item on the list is use limited administrative roles, and that will improve your score by 1.79%. The second one is turn on user risk policy. That will improve your score by 12.5%. So then the third column is user impact. Because remember what I said a moment ago, you don't want to be doing things that are going to make your users' lives miserable or make it difficult for them to do their job. So you can gauge what kind of impact making these particular or implementing these particular recommendations is going to have on your users. Is it something that they're not even going to notice, or is it something that's going to have a big impact on their everyday lives? So the first recommendation was to use limited administrative roles. And you can see that the user impact is low, and the reason for that is the users aren't administrators. So this doesn't affect them at all. They'll never even see this. That's why it's a low impact. On the other hand, turning on user risk policy carries a moderate impact to the users because turning on the user risk policy is something that directly impacts end users. And then the column on the right is the implementation cost. So there's a low cost associated with using limited administrative roles because those roles are something that is built into Azure AD. At the same time, there's a moderate cost associated with turning on user risk policy because that's something that requires an Azure AD premium subscription. So if you don't already have that subscription, then there's going to be an extra cost involved. So those are the basic pieces of information that are provided for each recommendation. Now, before I get into some more of these recommendations and what they really mean and all that, one thing that I want to stress is that the best practices that you see are often vendor-specific. Hopefully that's something that I've made clear throughout this presentation. The best practices that you see are generally going to be based on each provider's own implementation of IAM. And even though those best practices are important, it's equally important to think about the reasons behind those best practices and whether a best practice is right for your organization, because every once in a while you'll find that one of these best practices can be counterproductive if you were to implement it in your own organization. Sometimes there is a perfectly justifiable reason for not adhering to a particular best practice. And as long as you can justify it, it's okay. So why is IAM important? Why does any of this matter? Well, IAM has been around for as long as computer networking has. It hasn't always been called IAM. It's gone by a variety of names over the decades, but it's always been there. So why are we talking about this now? Why is it suddenly so much more important than it used to be? Well, what it really comes down to, at least in my opinion, is that there's been a fundamental shift in the way that enterprise computing is done. I mean, maybe I'm giving away my age here, but back when I started in IT back in the 90s, things were so different because the network was generally confined to a particular building. Maybe a large organization had multiple buildings, but the building at least loosely represented the network perimeter. Everything inside of the building was trusted. Typically, it was domain-joined enterprise desktops running Windows. All of the servers were trusted. They were configured according to the organization's needs. And the idea was that as long as you can keep anything from the outside from coming into the inside, you were secure. So the main thing that you had to focus on was defending your perimeter, keeping the bad guys out, and keeping any of your assets from leaving through that perimeter. Today things are different because the perimeter is basically gone. I mean, think about it. A lot of us still have resources in our own data centers, which is totally fine, but we also use multiple clouds out there. So we have all of these computing resources that are scattered across clouds and in our own data centers, and even our users are scattered. Most of them are probably still working from home, typically from personal devices. So the perimeter is gone. For all practical purposes, it doesn't exist anymore. So what that really means is that you have to take a brand new approach to keeping the bad guys out. You can't really focus on defending the perimeter anymore because the perimeter doesn't exist. So the next line of defense is identity. That's why a discussion of IAM best practices is so important, because identity is the one piece of glue that holds all of this together. If you can successfully defend the identities that are used throughout your resources, then everything else kind of falls into place. That's not to say that defending the identities is the only thing that you need to do, but it's one of those low-level, really fundamental tasks that has to be done in order for your other layers of security to work properly. Now, there is one very important caveat. At the very beginning of this presentation, I talked about my definition for IAM, and I talked about the various components that it typically includes. And I said that I agree with the definition, but that it was inadequate, that there was something missing. So what was that thing that was missing? Well, identity isn't limited solely to user accounts. Identity is also related to devices. In my opinion, device identity is almost as important as user identity, at least in certain aspects. So, as I mentioned earlier, in the early days, we had on-premises environments, and we had all these managed desktops that were domain joined in a Windows Server environment. So each one of those domain joined systems had an identity associated with it. When you domain join a system, there's an account that's created for that computer in the Active Directory. And believe it or not, there are a lot of similarities between that computer account and a user account. User accounts have a variety of attributes associated with them, one of those attributes being a password. And the same can be said for a computer account in the Active Directory. I mean, as weird as it sounds, there are actually things that you can do that will cause a Active Directory computer account's password to become out of sync with the password that's being maintained by the computer itself. And that computer won't be able to authenticate into the Active Directory because of that password mismatch. And then at that point, you have to go in and make some adjustments to bring everything back in sync. So the point being that PC identity has been a thing for decades. Now, it's not quite as important in that regard today as it once was, just because so many people are working from personal devices. But device identity is still a really important part of the IAM architecture. So how so? Well, there are several different ways of thinking about device identity. From a user perspective, users don't really care about the identity of the device that they're using, but they want to know that the server that they're communicating with is what it claims to be. They want to know that they're talking to a server that's legitimately being run by your organization, or in the case of a website, they want to know that they're actually accessing that website and not some rogue website that's actually managed to intercept their traffic. So that's the user perspective. From an admin perspective, certainly the admin wants to know that their servers are trustworthy and that nothing's been replaced by a rogue system. But there are also other questions like, is the user working from a managed device? Is that device trustworthy? And perhaps more importantly, is the device compliant with the security policies that the organization has laid out for devices? So the bottom line is that user identity and device identity are both important. And so as you work to establish best practices for IAM, you need to be thinking about both users and devices, not just users. So let's go back to the secure score that I mentioned a moment ago. As I pointed out, at the bottom of the screen, there are some best practices that Microsoft lays out. So let's take a look at some of those. The items that Microsoft lists, I know that this is a little bit tough to read. They include use limited administrative roles, turn on user risk policy, designate more than one global admin, enable policy to block legacy authentication, ensure all users can complete multi-factor authentication for secure access, require MFA for administrative roles, enable self-service password reset, do not expire passwords, turn on sign-in risk policy, and do not allow users to grant consent to unmanaged applications. Some of these recommendations can be adopted right here, right now as best practices. Some of them, maybe not so much. And then some of them you'll find are contradictory to what other cloud providers offer. So I'm not going to go into all of these, but I do want to talk about a few of them. So let's start with the use limited administrative roles. Now, that's something that's baked into Azure AD. It's something you can do right here, right now. And incidentally, Amazon also has a very similar best practice. And even though the interface is a little bit different, they also support the use of role-based access control. So it's something that you can readily adopt right now if you're not already. So why use limited administrative roles? Well, there are a few reasons. For one thing, in a large organization, it's really rare for a single admin to need access to absolutely everything. So it's a good idea to restrict permissions to just what is actually needed rather than giving someone unnecessary permissions. Because if an account has excessive permissions, then a breach can become a lot worse than it otherwise would be. Because if an account is compromised, then the attacker who compromised that account is going to inherit the same permissions as that account. And if that account has more permissions than what's really needed, then that's only going to increase what the attacker is able to do. And even if it's not a human attacker, the same thing can also go for malware. Also, excessive permissions can be problematic from a compliance standpoint, so just something to think about. So what you see right here is the screen that exists within the Azure Active Directory Admin Center that allows you to implement role-based access control. I'm going to throw in a few of these screenshots from time to time. I'm certainly not going to turn this into a hands-on walkthrough of everything that I'm talking about just because I've got so much material to cover. But I at least wanted to present the screen for the benefit of anybody who's never seen it before. So this is the Azure Active Directory Admin Center. And to get to this, all you do is go to the dashboard and then click on Roles and Administrators. And you're taken to the screen that shows a bunch of built-in roles. So what you do is whenever a user needs to be able to perform certain administrative tasks, you find the administrative role that aligns with that task and then add the user to that role, rather than just making the user an admin over everything. And incidentally, if you look at the very top, just under where it says Roles and Administrators, there's an icon that you can click to create new custom roles. So if you have a really unique need that isn't well served by any of the built-in roles, you can create your own roles. So another best practice, designate more than one global admin. And this is one of those where things get a little bit dicey. Some of the best practices out there are contradictory, and there are pros and cons that you have to weigh out with regard to whether or not you want to adopt this particular best practice. So designating more than one global admin is a Microsoft best practice. You saw it a moment ago on that list of security recommendations that I showed you with Identity Secure Score. So you have to stop and think about if this is going to be right for your organization, because a global admin typically has access to everything, and there are risks associated with having such an account. So from a risk management standpoint, it would seem that having fewer global admin accounts, if any global admin accounts, would be the way to go. But having said that, just having a single global admin account carries risks of its own, because if something happens to that account, you can end up getting locked out. And as a matter of fact, that's something that I've actually run into in the real world. Not in my own organization or an organization that I worked for, but it happened to a friend of mine. In his organization, he had one global admin account, and this was quite a few years back, so everything was on premises at the time. So he had one he was just using the built-in administrator account, and one of the administrators in the organization changed the password. Okay, no problem. That's a regular thing to do. Well, if you're familiar with the Windows password change mechanism, it asks you to enter your old password, enter your new password, and then retype your new password. Well, whoever changed the password retyped it incorrectly twice. So the password got changed to something unknown, and nobody could figure out what it was. So at that point, they were completely locked out of the only account that they had that had full-blown administrative privileges over the organization. So what did they do? Well, I'm sure some of you are familiar with the sysinternals tools that appear on the Microsoft website. Back in the 90s, there was a commercial version of that called WinTernals, I believe it was, and they had something called the WinTernals Administrator Pack. And it was, for lack of a better word, essentially a collection of hacker tools for Windows. And there was a mechanism in there that would allow you to bypass the normal Windows security and change an account's password without having to know what the password was. So that's how we fixed the problem. Had those tools not existed at the time, then the solution would have been to do an authoritative restoration of the domain controller. So you have to consider what would happen if a global admin account became locked out or compromised or something like that. So that may justify the need for a secondary global admin account. At the very least, you're going to need a break glass account. I'll be talking about break glass accounts in more detail as we go along, but a break glass account is a special account that you can use to put everything back to normal in the event that something bad happens. So I'll get into that a little bit later as we go along. So another best practice that Microsoft gives is to ensure that all users can complete multi-factor authentication for secure access. This is another one of those best practices that sounds really good on paper, but you have to be careful about how you implement it, because there can be consequences associated with implementing multi-factor authentication requirement policies. I mean, on one hand, this sounds like a great policy. There are numerous statistics out there that show that requiring multi-factor authentication can block any number of attacks. I've seen figures like 98%, 99%, something like that, of account takeover attacks. So multi-factor authentication is a good thing. I would highly recommend it. But as I said, you have to be careful about how you implement it, because blanket multi-factor authentication requirements can break things in your organization. So what kind of things? Well, if you've got applications that use service accounts, you don't want to require multi-factor authentication for that, because service accounts log in automatically, so there's nobody there to perform any kind of multi-factor authentication. Typically, a service account won't even work with multi-factor authentication. Also, if you've got applications that use legacy authentication protocols, they may or may not support multi-factor authentication depending on what it is that's being used. The same can also be said for automated scripts that require certain permissions. A lot of organizations have PowerShell scripts that perform automated authentication in order to perform some sort of automated task, and that's another thing that could break if you require multi-factor authentication across the board. So just something to think about. So let's go back to the recommendation for having a break glass account. A break glass account is essentially an account that you can use to recover from misconfiguration. For example, if you were to apply a policy and you applied that policy across the board and it had some unexpected effect and all of a sudden everything's locked out or you've crippled your network or something like that, you could log in using that break glass account and use that account to put everything back to normal. So having said that, break glass accounts really need to be exempt from multi-factor authentication requirements, because you don't want anything standing in your way of being able to use that break glass account to fix the problem at hand. So break glass accounts, in my opinion, need to be really secure, but not secure at all, if that makes any sense whatsoever. They need to be really secure from the standpoint of they should be protected with an extremely long, complex password. Which is fine, because this is something that you should theoretically never have to use, so it's not like a user is going to be having to key in that password every single day or something like that. But at the same time, you want to keep that account relatively unsecure from the standpoint of not applying policies to it, because you don't want anything restricting that account that might have unforeseen consequences down the road and stand in your way of being able to use that account to fix a problem should the need arise. So another Microsoft best practice is to require multi-factor authentication for administrative roles. So what kind of roles? Well, the roles that you see listed on the screen are the minimum set of roles that Microsoft recommends requiring multi-factor authentication for. Certainly you can require multi-factor authentication for additional roles. There's nothing wrong with that as long as it doesn't break anything. But this is the bare minimum role set that Microsoft recommends using multi-factor authentication for. And as you can see, these are all just administrative roles, things like the global admin, the application admin, authentication admin, billing, cloud application, conditional access, exchange, help desk, password, privileged authentication, privileged role admin, security, SharePoint, and user admin. And not every organization is going to have every one of these roles, but if you do, then you should be using multi-factor authentication for these roles. So what else? Another Microsoft best practice is to enable user self-service password reset. And this is a best practice that I definitely agree with. This is one of those things that is going to make your users' lives easier, it's going to make your life easier, and it's going to improve security all at the same time. So it's definitely a good thing. So from a user standpoint, it's going to make their lives easier because if they happen to lock themselves out, they don't have to make that embarrassing phone call to the help desk and say, hey, I'm locked out again. Can you reset my password? If they happen to lock themselves out at 3 o'clock in the morning and nobody is manning the help desk at that hour, that's not a problem either, because they can just go in and reset their own password on an as-needed basis. From an admin standpoint, this is good because it means that you're not wasting help desk resources on something silly like resetting user passwords. Now, certainly you can still reset user passwords manually if need be, but you're not going to have every user contacting the help desk for password resets. I mentioned a moment ago that this can improve security, though, and there is a reason why Microsoft listed this as an IEM best practice. And the reason is because if you really stop and think about it, I mentioned earlier that IT is changing dramatically. I talked about the evaporation of the network perimeter. But that's not the only major change that's happened in recent years. Excuse me one second, I need to grab a little water. Another major change that has happened is the adoption of zero trust. Now, most organizations, at least right now, haven't fully adopted zero trust across everything, but we're certainly headed that direction. So why does that matter? Well, zero trust is often thought of with regard to information systems, systems being configured so that they have to prove their identities anytime resources are accessed. But in my mind, zero trust involves a lot more than just information systems. It also involves the people who operate those information systems. So when you enable self-service password reset, what you're doing is you're essentially taking the help desk staff out of the picture. And that helps with a zero trust implementation because you have less human element involved in the password reset process. You know, in most organizations, I'm sure the help desk staff is fine. I'm sure they're great people. But at the same time, you don't want to assume anything because zero trust is all about not making assumptions. So if you can keep the help desk staff out of the loop, then that's one more security loophole that you've addressed. Because think about what happens when a user has to contact the help desk for a password reset. They typically give the help desk staff the name of the account that has to be reset, and then the help desk staff has to do something to validate the user's identity. Hopefully this involves something like sending a code to the user's mobile device, but not every organization does that. So it could be something like, hey, answer this security challenge question for me. And if they do, then at that point, whoever is working the help desk knows the answer to that user's security question. So just imagine if that user is like a high-level executive in the company. Now, that help desk staff member knows what the new password is, and they know what the security question is for that user. So sensitive information has just been given to the help desk technician who may or may not actually need that information and may or may not use it for the purposes it was intended. So implementing self-service password just kind of eliminates all of that. And it also, if your users are using an automated mechanism to reset their own passwords, then if somebody at the help desk does manually change a user's password or reset an account, assuming you've got the proper auditing in place, then it brings attention to that. So if you've got anything nefarious going on, it just makes it stand out a little bit more than it might otherwise. So what happens when you enable self-service password reset? Well, typically, the user is going to have to provide some means of authentication. That might be by a mobile app notification, a mobile app code, an email message, something sent to their phone, or just the existence of a phone. And there are sometimes other options, too, such as an office phone number or a security question. There are various options. There are self-service password resets that are built into Azure AD, which you'll see in just a second. But there are also some really great third-party solutions out there. So here's what the Azure AD self-service password reset mechanism looks like. And I'm still in the Azure Active Directory Admin Center. And to get to this, you just go to the dashboard, click on Password Reset, and then you're taken to the screen that allows you to enable self-service password reset. So what else? Well, another best practice is to avoid expiring passwords. And this is one of those that people seem to have really strong opinions one way or the other about. But a couple of years ago, maybe even a little bit longer than that now, I'm not exactly sure what the date was, Microsoft came out and said, hey, we don't want you to force users to change passwords on a regular basis anymore. And then some of the other providers, or some of the other security standards organizations, such as NIST, came out and adopted similar policies. And the reason behind such policies is really simple. If you're requiring users to have really long and complex passwords, and those passwords are getting changed on a frequent basis, then the user is almost definitely going to have to write that password down or use the password on multiple sites or do something to make that password easier to remember. And that can actually undermine your security. So the best practice is to just avoid requiring users to change passwords on a regular basis. So what are the new password guidelines? Well, again, the standards kind of vary from one vendor to the next, but here are the ones from NIST as of November. They say that password length is more important than complexity, which I would tend to agree with. They also say don't enforce password resets. Screen all new passwords against a list of commonly used and compromised passwords. So why is that important? Well, imagine that an attacker manages to get a hold of a user system and they get all of the password hashes. Well, there are utilities out there that have already gone in and hashed really commonly used passwords, and there are entire dictionaries out on the dark web that contain passwords that are known to have been used with other accounts. So it's way more efficient for an attacker to compare password hashes against a database of password hashes and then look up any matches from that database and get the password than to actually try to decrypt all of the passwords. Decryption takes forever. Looking up a hash in a database is a really simple process that doesn't take much time at all. So that's why it's so important to screen new passwords against lists of commonly used and compromised passwords. Also, allow the pasting of passwords, because that's one of those things that's going to make your lives easier. They're not going to have to deal with the frustration of keying in a great big long complex password and realizing that they made a typo somewhere and having to do it again and again, because all of that leads to account lockouts and user frustration and things like that. Enable show password while typing. Again, you got to be careful with this one because you always have to think about shoulder surfing. But in today's world where so many people are working in their own homes, there's really no reason to mask passwords. Typically, people are going to be by themselves anyway, so it doesn't really matter if the passwords show up on screen or not. Limit the number of failed password attempts before lockout. Implement two-factor authentication, and salt and hash passwords. So those are the current NIST recommendations. So let's see what else we got. Turn on sign-in risk policy. Sign-in risk policies are part of the conditional access policies in Azure AD. And conditional access policies require Azure AD Premium P1, but sign-in risk policies require an extra level of Azure AD Premium. They require Azure AD Premium P2. I'm going to come back to this one in a little bit because I really need to talk about conditional access policies before I can do any justice to talking about sign-in risk policies. Do not allow users to grant consent to unmanaged applications. This is an important one. The idea here is that users are inclined to install anything and everything. We all know that. We've seen countless examples of that. You know, back in the 90s when I had a corporate job, controls didn't exist back then that we have now, so it was really easy for users to install things. And I couldn't tell you how many times I had to deal with malware infections because users installed something that they weren't supposed to. Or I would even occasionally have users go in and delete things that they didn't recognize, like system files, to make room for a video game. And even though the technology has changed and the restrictions have changed, there's still a temptation for users to install things. I mean, it's so easy to go out to an app store and install something. So the idea is that you should not allow users to grant consent to an unmanaged application. Now, that's not saying block the installation of an unmanaged application. That's saying that if the application comes back and says, hey, I want permission to do this, 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 and this, you block the user from granting those extra permissions to that application, because who knows what that application is going to do with those permissions. I mean, users are typically going to go ahead and grant permissions without really stopping to think about the implications of doing that. And all it takes is one bad click. So what does that look like? So here we are back in the Azure Active Directory Admin Center. And from the dashboard, you click on Enterprise Applications and then go to the User Consent Settings tab, which you can see right here. And so there are three options. Do not allow user consent. Allow users consent for apps from verified publishers for selected permissions, and that's the recommended action. And then allow user consent for apps. So you can pick one of these options to control what users are allowed to do when installing applications. Now, there are some additional settings that are worth knowing about. Now, the top arrow is actually pointing to the wrong setting. It was supposed to have pointed to the setting below that. You can see that there's a whole section on admin consent request. So the first setting, the one that the arrow was supposed to point to, says users can request admin consent to apps they are unable to consent to. So in other words, if you block a user from being able to consent to give an application permissions to do something, they can send a request to an admin. And then you'll notice the lower arrow, this is a consent request expires after setting. So if an admin doesn't respond right away, you can actually make it so that that user request expires. So you don't just have that request hanging out there for all perpetuity. So what else do we have? Designate a single Azure AD directory as the authenticative source for corporate and organizational accounts. And the reason for this best practice is that a lot of organizations have multiple Azure AD accounts. So how's that even possible? Well, think about my own organization. I'm a one-man shop, so my footprint is really small. But yet at the same time, I've got multiple Azure AD accounts because I have an Azure account, and that comes with Azure AD, but I also have a Microsoft 365 account, and that has Azure AD as well. So what this best practice is really saying is that if you've got multiple directories, try to consolidate that so that you have one source of the truth. You've got one authoritative source for authentication, and you don't have accounts and settings and things like that scattered across multiple disjoint environments. So this all goes back to what I was talking about at the very beginning with ensuring consistency. And I just looked at the clock. I'm going to have to speed up a little bit. Another best practice, don't synchronize accounts to Azure AD that have high privileges in your existing Active Directory instance. Now, if this one's a mouthful, it needs a little bit of deciphering, but what this really means is that Microsoft has a tool called Azure AD Connect, and what it does is it synchronizes on-premises Active Directory environments up to Azure Active Directory. So if you've got accounts on premises, then you can synchronize those accounts up to the Azure Active Directory instance running in the cloud so that those accounts exist out there. It really helps with single sign-on and things like that. What this best practice really comes down to is it's saying that if you've got highly privileged accounts on premises, you probably don't want to replicate those accounts up to the cloud because that can constitute a security risk. And the good news is that Azure AD blocks the synchronization, Azure AD Connect blocks the synchronization of those accounts by default, so you don't even have to worry about it. What this best practice is really saying is just don't go in and change that. There's a reason why those accounts are being blocked from being synchronized. So another thing to think about is the issue of zero trust. I touched on this a little bit just a moment ago, and I mentioned that even though most organizations haven't fully implemented zero trust just yet, things are definitely headed in that direction. So as you think about IAM best practices, it's a really good idea to think about zero trust and how the best practices that you're implementing today can aid in that journey toward zero trust implementation. So this is where conditional access comes into play, and I mentioned conditional access just a moment ago. So the basis of zero trust is that anytime a user attempts to access a resource, that user's identity has to be validated. You're not just going to allow the user to sign in once and have their identity be valid for the duration of their entire session. That's kind of the old way of doing things. We would use groups to manage permissions to resources. A user would log in, and if they were a member of a group that had access to a particular resource, then they were able to access that resource. But the thing about it is, in some circumstances, it might not be in your best interest to allow a user to access a particular resource, even if the user technically does have permission to access that resource. And this all comes down to risk and to access patterns and things like that. The classic example that I always throw out there is if you've got a user who comes in every morning at 9 a.m. and the first thing they do is open up a particular application, well, there's a pattern there. They do that every Monday morning at 9 a.m., and it's predictable. On the other hand, if that same user logs in at 3 o'clock in the morning from a rogue nation on the other side of the world and tries to access that application, well, that might be a signal that you've got a problem, and maybe it's not in your best interest to allow that access. So that's what conditional access is all about. It's about looking at the bigger picture, not just group membership, but other factors, and taking those factors into account when deciding whether or not you want to grant access to a particular resource. And so, not surprisingly, one of the best practices is to leverage conditional access policies, which, as I mentioned a moment ago, requires an Azure AD Premium P1 subscription. So conditional access policies are similar to if-then statements. If a particular condition is true, then we allow access to this resource, or we block access to the resource, or we require an additional step, such as additional authentication. So conditional access policies are made up of signals, and they're made up of actions. So signals can be based on a whole bunch of different things. I'm talking about things like group memberships, device type, device operating system versions, whether or not the operating system is jailbroken, whether the device is logging in from a trusted IP address range, or if it's logging on from a country or a region whose IP addresses you don't trust, and what type of data is being accessed. That's the really big one right there. You might require more stringent authentication if the user is attempting to access something really sensitive. So what do we do when an access request is made? Well, we make a decision, and that decision can be grant access to the app or to the resource, block access to the resource, or require some additional security, such as making sure that the device is compliant, making sure that the device is managed, in other words, joined to Azure AD, making sure that multi-factor authentication is being used, or making sure that a particular client is being used or not used. So this is extremely flexible. And I don't really have time to get into a lot of the rest of this, but one thing that I did want to mention, there's one more best practice that's really important, and that is blocking legacy authentication. So networks have been around for longer than most people really care to think about. And there are a lot of legacy components out there. And sometimes legacy protocols let me just say that again. Sometimes legacy protocols are used during the authentication process. And those legacy protocols can pose certain security risk. It might be possible to sniff the packets that are being used for authentication, or they might prevent the use of multi-factor authentication or something like that. So it's really important to block the use of legacy authentication. So how do we do that? Well, the first thing that you have to do is to know which protocols it is that support legacy authentication. And here's a list of some of the ones in the Microsoft scope that do that. And a lot of these are exchange related. We've got things like MAPI over HTTP, POP3, stuff like that, auto-discover. So these are what Microsoft means when they say legacy authentication protocols. So how do you block that? Well, you can block them either directly or indirectly. Directly blocking these protocols involves using an interface like this. And this comes straight from Azure Active Directory, and I've provided the source at the bottom of this slide so that you can go out to this article and see the exact steps. But essentially, there's a GUI interface that you can use to go in and block the use of these protocols. You can also block it indirectly. And the way that you do that is by setting up policy requirements that would fail if somebody happens to be using one of these protocols. For example, if you're requiring multi-factor authentication and a legacy protocol doesn't support multi-factor authentication, then you've effectively blocked the use of that policy because the requirement for multi-factor authentication can't be satisfied if that protocol is being used. So that was a huge amount of stuff to get through, and I haven't even quite touched on all of it. But I know that there are some questions and answers out there, so I want to go ahead and spend the last couple of minutes answering any questions that I can.
Okay. Great job, Brian. Like you said, it's a very extensive topic. It's hard to cover in 45, 50 minutes.
I was talking fast.
We do have a few minutes for questions, so let's get right to them. First one comes from David. Are there any dangers to enabling self-service password for users?
Certainly there are ways that can be exploited, not so much from the standpoint of account takeover, as much as I've seen it used for denial of service. I've seen situations, not firsthand, but I've read about them, where an attacker has gone in and issued a gazillion self-service password resets as a way of locking down a bunch of accounts. And so then an administrator had to go in and re-enable all of those accounts. So maybe that could be classified as a danger, but it's not something that's super common.
Okay. Next question comes from Emily. Any guidance on using a password vault?
Any guidance on using a password vault?
Vault, yes.
Yes. It really kind of depends. The biggest recommendation that everybody tends to make with password vaults is to make sure that the vault itself is protected with a really strong, secure password and don't write it down or anything. I tend not to use password vaults just because if that one password is compromised, then everything in the vault is compromised. I tend to think that from a security perspective, it's a lot better to secure all of the individual passwords rather than trying to just keep that vault secure. But I don't know. I'm kind of on the fence about that one.
Okay. Continuing the password theme, next question reads, do you think that passwords will eventually go away?
I think that passwords will mostly go away over the next few years, but I think that it's going to be at least a couple of decades before passwords completely disappear, just because there are so many legacy systems out there that are still in use that can't function without passwords. Just to throw an example out there, I was at a major retailer over the weekend, and I was at the register, and they were having some problems and had to reboot it. And I got to look at the screen, and their system was based on Windows 2000, if you can believe that. We're talking about an operating system that's, 23 years old now? And so apparently they don't have any plans of changing that anytime soon. That's an example of a system that definitely would not work without a password.
Okay, one last question, and of course, it's about passwords.
Of course.
The question reads, what do you think about the idea of setting passwords to never expire?
I think that as long as you meet those length requirements and you're doing the proper auditing so that you can tell if a password's been compromised, and you're checking against that database of known leaked passwords, I think that the idea of not expiring passwords is great. Let's face it, nobody likes changing their password on a regular basis just because the system told them to. So I love it from that perspective, but I also think that anything that you can do to discourage a user from writing down their password or from using the same password on multiple systems is only a good thing.
Okay, well, it looks like that's all the questions we have time for. So thanks again, Brian, for an excellent presentation and answering those questions.
Thank you.